He is the play-by-play voice of the WNBA's Indiana Fever. He is also the Indiana Pacers fill-in radio, TV play-by-play commentator. I'm also a silent reporter for the Indiana Pacers. We welcome back Pat Boylan onto Hoopsology. Welcome back, Pat.
Good to be back with you guys. Sorry to make you rattle off such a long title there.
No worries. It's awesome to have you on. Last time we talked a lot about the Indiana Pacers, but this podcast we want to focus on the W and the Fever. I think they're one of the most fascinating stories in all of sports. And so before we kind of get into how the Fever are doing now, I kind of want to get your perspective on this the season for you in terms of just the media attention and just how the season has unfolded. So we're nearing the All-Star break. Like, what is your overall vibe of the season? To kind of take it any way you want, just in terms of yourself, in terms of just the added attention onto this team, the fan attention, just the games themselves with Caitlin Clark and Aaliyah Boss becoming this great dynamic duo. Like, what's your impression so far of this season for the Fever?
Well, my initial impressions are just how gratified I am to be a part of this and how gratifying it is to have a small role on what is such a massive storyline right now around sports and such a magnified area and team right now that Caitlin Clark, of course, has brought in. You know, I could sit here and tell you all the ways that my world has changed and our world has changed over the last few months, but it would probably take up the entirety of this podcast. You know, this is my 10th year doing play-by-play for the Fever. I took over full-time in 2018, so I was splitting games with Kristen Airy, who's the TV voice of the Pacers and was for the Fever for a very long time. I've never experienced anything remotely close to this. We've seen the Fieldhouse sold out for WNBA games before, but they were WNBA Finals games. And we're a couple months into this, and I still find myself scraping my jaw off the floor from time to time. I mean, when you're sitting in the arena and the pregame introductions are happening, and you're looking up into the top corners of the arena, and you can't find an open seat, and that's not a one-off. It's going to happen 2 days later at their next home game too, and it does happen. And for us to be about halfway through the home schedule, a little bit halfway through the season, and we haven't even seen any sort of blip on the radar in terms of any of that interest falling off. Our TV numbers are through the roof. I mean, every different dynamic that you can look at from this team is just through the roof. And the spotlight Caitlin has brought, you guys have seen it. I don't need to tell you it's massive, but at the same time, I will tell you, getting to be a little bit closer to the action, having the access that I do, I've just been blown away at how she has handled all of this. I mean, I think ESPN ranked her the fourth most popular athlete in the U.S., and it feels that way. And here we are, into mid-July, and she hasn't made a verbal misstep yet. I mean, it's stunning. She's 22 years old. She does all the right things. She says all the right things. And you really started to see her play on the floor really start to take off over the last 4 or 5 weeks. And in my opinion, she's now playing like a top 10 player in the WNBA. So when you pair her with last year's Rookie of the Year, Leah Boston, and another All-Star in Kelsey Mitchell, and a number 2 overall pick from a couple years back in Alyssa Smith, this team started 1-8, but they're 8-4 since. And you're starting to see this team gel together. And as the schedule has normalized some, they've really taken off in terms of their success level.
Can you take us inside just the organization during the first part of this season in terms of a lot of different things happening, to Caitlin Clark being introduced, to, like you said, the 1-8 start, to the Fever missing Kelsey Mitchell? Like, what was the dynamic of the team specifically in terms of the dynamic? Was it different than any other teams you've experienced? Because despite them struggling, they're also dealing with all these new things that are happening to this team they've never experienced before. So what was that like for you, just covering it, just the vibe of just the first part of the season?
Well, I kind of look at that question from 2 different angles. Angle number 1 is this. The Fever are far from the first team that's ever brought together some young talent that's tried to figure out their way early in the season, that struggled early on in the year, that maybe has had a tough schedule early on. I mean, those type of themes you see in sports. Other teams have dealt with that. there's maybe a little bit of an NBA comp with Victor Wembanyama and the San Antonio Spurs. So from that angle, we've seen teams try to gel together with a lot of young players, and they're all kind of figuring each other out. That's not overly new to sports, but what makes this so hard for me to compare to anything else is while this is happening, there is unprecedented level of attention, spotlight, and scrutiny. So if something goes wrong, whereas one team might have this sort of media attention or scrutiny, it's all over the place. It's everywhere. The Fever are 1-8, and the sky is falling. Not really, but that was kind of the national narrative. And there were some people that were even ridiculously going so far as to question if Caitlin Clark's game would translate to the next level. I think those that follow and have followed this story close enough know that the Fever had probably the most brutal schedule to open up a season in the history of the WNBA. You would have liked to be better than 1-8 after 9, of course, but it really wasn't all that shocking to me because if you spread these games out over the course of a season, these at New York's and at Las Vegas and at Connecticut, how many times you're playing Seattle, these top teams, you're probably going to have about that record. They're just all condensed in the beginning of the season. And just the amount of media attention that this team got and had to handle was something I don't look. Caitlin Clark is relatively used to this, but for all these other players, I mean, even Aaliyah Boston, who comes from a massive program in South Carolina that is more successful than any in recent memory, this was all very, very new. The pressure was massive early on, but I think once things started to turn around and you start to win a couple games, things also snowballed in the other direction really quickly. And as the schedule normalized a bit, players got to know each other a little bit and started having some success. Then that all of that attention can work in your direction too. We're seeing sold out arenas everywhere we go. The Fever just played in Minnesota where there was a standing ovation on the road for Caitlin Clark and the Fever at the end of games. So the other side of that is when things are going well, you've got this massive, massive fan base that's behind you and that has your back. But it was certainly challenging. I mean, for Christy Sides, who's a good young coach, to all of a sudden have this much scrutiny. But I tend to think that it could be something that they're grateful for down the road, maybe even later in this season, that they had to overcome all of those arduous obstacles early in the year. That it's a little cliche, but I think it has the potential to make you tougher as the season goes on. And the good thing here for the Fever is once they come out of the All-Star break, they've got the Olympic break, they've got a very, very home-heavy final 14 games. So they're in a playoff spot right now, but really their most favorable stretch of schedule still might be in front of them.
Pat, that's all great. I have to go back, and you brought up the schedule and the rigors of that, and I think it's great. And hopefully the team as well has a positive spin on that, like you put on it there, that it'll make them tougher and battle tested later in the season. Any sort of resentment, either from fan base or otherwise, towards that schedule that I believe, as you mentioned, I think it's the most packed schedule we've seen in the WNBA since 2015, if I remember correctly, with another organization. Any resentment towards that schedule? And maybe, my words, not yours, I would argue a competitive disadvantage.
I think most of the intelligent fans knew what was going on. And even those who maybe were new to the WNBA, all it takes is seeing how many times you're playing New York and Vegas, and then looking, even if you didn't follow the league last year, you go to the standings and you see, well, these are the top two teams. Connecticut's a top 3 team. Seattle got a couple of Olympians and superstar type players in free agency and during the off season. And I think there are a lot of intelligent basketball fans here in Indiana, and there are a lot of intelligent basketball fans in Iowa. And so I do think a lot of people realize that. But that doesn't necessarily make it any easier. So I think there maybe was resentment feels strong, but frustration, I think, is probably the right word. Because if the Fever have a different schedule to begin the season, let's say in their first 12 games they're playing, 8 of them at home, and they've got a nice mix of some of the teams near the bottom. And then after 12 games, they're 7-5. And Clark's having more success because she's not going up against some of the top defenses night in and night out. The narrative is totally different. And you could argue to a degree, there's nothing that the Fever could do to control that. Now, of course they can. You're playing on the floor. You can win a game and all that. But you can't control who you play. And there was almost no realistic scenario where the Fever were going to get off to a good start. And so the flip side of that, the optimistic angle on all of this that you could take and that, I'm hopeful we'll see here is, look, those were going to be really hard games to win, whether they were games 1 through 9 or whether they were games 31 through 40. You're probably dropping a majority of those games either way because those teams are at a level right now that you aren't quite at yet. You are building toward. So if you get them out of the way early while you're still trying to figure out your own chemistry, then you're in a stronger spot here in the back half of the season. You yourself are a better team, and you yourself are playing an easier schedule, an easier caliber of opponent. So mentally, I feel confident in saying no WNBA team has ever gone through the rigors and the spotlight and the scrutiny that the Fever faced in those first 10 plus games. It's never happened in the WNBA, and it has probably happened in the NBA. But when you consider the audience here that's tuning into these games, it really is at, she feels to me like she's at a LeBron James, Steph Curry type level. So it's something you haven't seen a ton in sports, not necessarily the spotlight, but then paired with just how challenging that early stretch of schedule was. But again, I do think it's something that ultimately they could benefit from and potentially even this year.
Well said, Pat. I want to zoom out again and just focus in on Caitlin Clark, especially since you, of any of the guests that we've had on, have arguably the closest connection to her, the closest ties, being that you are announcing for the team. With Caitlin Clark, just in your opinion, why is she this anomaly and this maybe catalyst for growth of the league? What is the mass appeal that you have seen in person? I mean, why is it that not only in Indiana, but when she goes to Minnesota, when she goes to Atlanta, when she goes all over the country, these games are selling out?
To be honest with you, I think an Iowa broadcaster, an Iowa writer could probably give you an even better idea of that. But I think she's just the perfect storm here. I mean, if you remember when Steph Curry started taking over the NBA, when people realized just how good he was and the things he was doing, nobody had ever done them before. No one was pulling up regularly from 35 feet, and anybody that was certainly wasn't making them. There wasn't a women's player that had done that before Caitlin Clark. So I think it was initially this like Steph Curry type factor for the first time on the women's side that drew people to watch Caitlin Clark. And then they saw the passing, right? She led the NCAA in assists her final 3 years and is leading the WNBA in assists, at least as we are talking right now. And her all-around game and just the style that she plays. You don't see other players playing like this, and you really don't see it in many levels of basketball at all. I mean, it's not like a bunch of players came out and then were able to do what Steph Curry did. He's in a lot of ways one of one, and Caitlin Clark is one of one. And so that basketball ability, I think, then paired with the type of person she is, she's fiery, she's competitive, she's fun to watch. But then at the same time, she says all the right things. She's a terrific person, and she's just the perfect storm. And the other thing I think here is the women's game has been building to this moment. And I think that's something that Caitlin will be the first to tell you. There are other players that maybe if they came to the WNBA or came to the college game in 2019, 2020 like she did, that maybe some of these older players would have had a similar phenomenon happen. And Sabrina Ionescu is a great example of someone just a few years before her that was a big star in college, but not quite at the level of Caitlin Clark. So it's just been this perfect storm, I think, of women's basketball in the WNBA. It's consistently been growing. It's consistently been heading in the right direction. I always say this: if Caitlin Clark chose to play in the NWSL and she was a soccer player professionally, the WNBA would continue to go in the right direction without her. But what she has done has supercharged all of this. And it was, I think, the perfect environment waiting for the perfect player, and those two things, and person as well. And I think those two things have sparked what you've seen here.
It's so interesting. In some way, it feels kind of like the NBA and WNBA sort of like rhyming in verse, maybe, or maybe it's an echo effect. Point being, Caitlin Clark often gets compared to Steph Curry because of the shooting ability, the deep range, and while Steph Curry was blowing up in the NBA, LeBron was, I think it's fair to say, widely still accepted as the best player in the league at the time. Caitlin Clark is having this massive success, while I think most would agree Asia Wilson, although there's lots of talented players, certainly Asia Wilson is likely regarded as the MVP of the league right now, or very close to it, and has been for the past couple of years. So it's just interesting, the parallels between the leagues, and that it's not necessarily always the best player in the league maybe at the moment that drives a catalyst like this, although that's not to say, of course, that they haven't contributed to building the popularity that we've seen in the league.
Yeah, those were some interesting parallels there. I think there are a lot of them that you can make either in the NBA, and the NBA is 75 years old, and the WNBA is just over 25 years old. Hasn't yet hit its 30th anniversary. So I think that's something to keep in comparison too. This
For
really
sure.
is like the late 70s, if you're comparing it to when the NBA started, and it took the NBA a long, long time. Remember, Magic Johnson and Larry Bird were kind of saviors for the NBA, and that was in the
Right.
80s. That was 40 years in, and the WNBA is not yet 30 years in. So I
Right.
think they are experiencing some of those same parallels. But look, I agree. Caitlin Clark is far and away the most popular player in the WNBA right now. The best player in the WNBA right now is Asia Wilson, and second is probably Breanna Stewart. I think Clark is going to get into that conversation. In fact, I've been so impressed just how quickly she's morphed her way into, I think, a top 10 player, and how dramatically that has happened. I mean, night in and night out, she leads the league in assists. She's averaging 17 points per game. And look, we can conjure up stats and make things say whatever we want, but it's a fact that no player in WNBA history has ever averaged 16 and 7, and she's right now averaging 17 and 8. So what she's doing from a scoring and passing perspective, that is without much comparison. There have been players that per game have averaged more assists than Caitlin Clark. Courtney Vandersloot has done it a ton of times. Tisha Penicheiro, Sue Bird. There have been players that have done that. There have been players that have averaged more points per game than Clark is. She's averaging 17. There are more than a handful that are doing it this year. But the combination of those two things is unique in the WNBA. There have been great passers that are really good scorers, and there have been great scorers that are really good passers. I don't know yet that we've seen great for both, at least from the guard position. We've seen, and this was a trend in the NBA too. A lot of the stars, the big time stars, as the NBA was growing, were in the front court. They were centers and they were power forwards, and then eventually the game kind of morphed into a more guard centric game. And if you look at a lot of the legends of the WNBA game, Diana Taurasi is an exception, but most of them are power forwards and centers, and Tamika Catchings types that are kind of 3 or 4 type players. I think you're starting to see that growth too, where the game is becoming a little bit more guard oriented as well. And from a passing perspective and a scoring perspective, what Clark's doing right now has very little parallel or comparison.
What has been the one thing that has surprised you about Caitlin Clark, either about her game or her personality, that you didn't know before she put on an Indiana Fever uniform?
I talked about this earlier, so I don't mean to give a same answer that I already have, but just it's so impressive. I'm not sure how old you guys are, but 22 was a little bit ago for me. But I remember when I was 22, and I said the wrong thing a whole lot. And just it's her ability to look. I'm sure she has a great team that helps her with this, but let's be real. When the microphone is in front of your face that often, if you're just not a really good person, you're not going to be able to pull off what she's pulled off. And I think it's been just so awe-inspiring to see how often a microphone's in front of her, how often somebody is recording. And I'm sitting there going, man, she hasn't made a misstep yet. She hasn't done it. It's incredible because she gets asked all sorts of gotcha questions, right? It's not, why are you so good? And it's not all, why are the Fever winning lately? She gets asked some really tough questions. Why aren't you on the Olympic team? And she instead turns that into, well, let's look at how good the Olympic team is. So, I didn't totally know what to expect going into this. I knew it was going to be totally different than anything that we've ever seen. I knew we were going to get all sorts of big attendance numbers, big TV numbers, and all of that. And I've watched Caitlin Clark before. I'd seen Caitlin Clark before. I knew she had these abilities. But it's really the off the floor aspect that has impressed me the most. I don't know that I expected her to be affecting the game quite at this level right away, but I figured she would get there, and maybe even this season. So I have been impressed by that. But it's the off the floor perspective. Sometimes it's so easy to forget how young these young players are in professional sports. 22 years old, that's a college senior still. It's somebody who's just graduated college and maybe is taking their first job in the real world. And to have just the complete package in terms of how you handle yourself, what you say, when you say it, to have all that at 22 is so, so rare. And when I go back to the perfect storm analogy that we were making earlier, I think that's a big reason why people hear her speak, and it's powerful in a way, and it resonates. It really does resonate.
I also want to ask you about Kelsey Mitchell because I feel like once Kelsey got back into the starting lineup, the Fever, from what I observed, is they look a totally different team. Can you talk about the importance of Kelsey Mitchell and just how she fits in with kind of this duo over Leah Boston and Caitlin Clark? Because I think they're one of the, I think it's not unfair to say they're a big three.
Yeah.
I think they work fantastic together. So can you talk about that dynamic?
Well, the Fever have 3 All-Stars for just the second time in franchise history, and Kelsey Mitchell should not be forgotten here in this equation of what's turned the season around here for the Indiana Fever. And I just really love this for Kelsey because she's been through a lot. The Fever, with Tamika Catchings, she hung it up. She hung up the sneakers in 2016. And the 2017 season was a little bit of a step back, but it was really 2018 when the Fever started a full-fledged rebuild. And that was right when Kelsey Mitchell was drafted. And she's been through a lot. She's been through some tough times. She's been through not just some losing seasons, but some seasons where the Fever, really, to be frank, struggled to be competitive in most games. During all of that, she was having good years. She was having strong years, frankly, where she should have been an all-star and didn't get that recognition because the Fever's record just wasn't good enough. So for this to finally come around here for Kelsey, who has stayed loyal, it's been one of my favorite subplots of this whole season. And I think what you've seen, first, I think Caitlin and Aaliyah had to figure each other out. That's the duo when it comes right down to it. They're both 22 years old. They're both number 1 overall picks. They're both future Olympians. You could argue should be on this Olympic team, both of them. They're both future superstars in this game if they aren't already in that conversation. At the end of the day, those two and how those two are able to play off of each other probably is the most important thing here for this team. But that shouldn't take any spotlight away from how important Kelsey Mitchell is. And her role is different, right? She's been on the ball a lot for her career. And this is taking a little bit of a different role, frankly, a pretty big different role for Kelsey. But at the same time, the spotlight that Caitlin brings on the floor and the attention and the gravity that she has on the floor works well for Kelsey, because her whole career, when the Fever were struggling, the game plan was throw everything you have at Kelsey Mitchell and make somebody else beat us. And to her credit, she had some great years in there and some really efficient years in there. She had some 40% three-point shooting seasons, despite the fact that she was the only real top-flight offensive weapon that the Fever had. And now she's in a position and in a role where she can pick her spots a little bit more, where she can choose, where she wants to attack, and has opportunities where the defense aren't laser focused on her. I thought she's hit the biggest shot of the season so far, which you could debate. But in my opinion, the biggest shot that a Fever player has hit so far this year was in that New York game. Indiana's making that comeback. The Fever have a fast break. Caitlin gets it ahead to Kelsey. When she takes that shot, there's nobody there to rebound for Indiana. So she's pulling up for three, down three, late in the game, and if she misses, it's a New York rebound. And she put it right through the middle, and her ability late in games, I think, has been something that's really grown. I don't know that you would have called that a strength early in her career, but I do think you would call it a strength now. And I'm just really glad for her, because she's starting to get a lot of the attention that I think she deserved for years. And it's still a work in progress, and Caitlin figuring Kelsey out and vice versa. I don't think that's 100% there yet, but I think that should provide optimism for Fever fans too, because I still think they have some growing and some learning and some chemistry building that those two can still combine for at a higher level that they can get to.
So, Pat, given everything you've mentioned thus far, you mentioned, a home favorable schedule after the break here, and how the team has been able to gel and improve since that very frantic start that was forced on them. How high can this team soar? What are realistic expectations for the Fever marching on towards the postseason? Will we see them in the postseason, and how high do you think is reasonable to expect them to climb?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. Right now, as we're talking, they're in seventh. And the number one goal going into the season was to make the playoffs. And they've got work to do to get there, but they're in a pretty good spot. If you look at the standings, unfortunately, Atlanta's dealt with a lot of injury. They've fallen back lately as the Fever have taken a step forward. And Indiana has current tiebreak on Atlanta, and they've also got a few games of padding. So when the Olympic break finishes and we come back from it, Indiana's going to be in the driver's seat to make the playoffs. So that's kind of goal number one. They're in a great spot. They aren't there yet, but it's a home-heavy schedule out of the Olympic break, and they've got the current tiebreaker on Atlanta. They're currently, as we're talking, ahead of Chicago. They're actually not too far from sixth. Now, because of the start and because of how challenging the schedule was, sixth might be their ceiling. I think they would need – there's sort of a – depends on where you draw the tiers, but right now there kind of appears to be a line after the top five, and those top five teams, at least for the moment, have kind of checked out. And so I think you would need one of those teams to also simultaneously fall back while you are moving forward. But in their last 12, the Fever are 8-4. That's probably on the more optimistic side of things if you were to guess what this team is capable of, but I don't think so optimistic that it's not possible at all. I think it's very doable. They'll have 14 games coming out of the All-Star break. Could you do something like 9-5? And if you do that, I think you'll probably have a really good shot at being sixth. And maybe if you get some help, you could move up higher. But for this team, the goal is the playoffs. They're in a good spot right now. I think the level that they're playing at is more indicative of where this team is. And so 14 games coming out of it. They've got one more before the Olympic break, which will be important too. It's at Dallas, and how the Fever play on the road against a team that struggled and had some injuries could go a long way in determining that. But I think you come out of the Olympic break. And the other thing is, while frustrating that Caitlin Clark is not on the Olympic team, she's going to get a well-deserved break. And so coming out of that 4-week period where she's not in the Olympics, the silver lining is going to be that she should be physically in as good of a spot as she's been in a very, very long time. And I think that only aids the effort here going forward. You're probably out of hoping for home court advantage in the first round, although not out of the question. But I think there's still a lot that you can play for. And, avoiding a New York or Connecticut or Vegas in that first round would be something that would be very good for the Fever to be able to do. So that involves continuing to move up the standings, and I certainly think they can.
Are there any memories about this season, of this first half before we head to the WNBA All Star break that stand out to you, just in terms of I see these videos of Aaliyah Boston or Caitlin Clark signing autographs for fans before games or afterwards? Are there any type of those moments that I think the mainstream public are not seeing that stand out to you so far this season for the Fever?
I think going into that very first home game, so the first game the Fever played was on the road. We didn't broadcast it. One of the pitfalls isn't even really a fair word because it's really good for the franchise. But the Fever are on ESPN and ABC and CBS a whole lot more. And when they're on those channels, we cannot also air a broadcast. So it's meant we've done a lot less broadcasts this year for good reason. But of course, that opener in Connecticut, we did not do. So my first experience with just this whole new world was the home opener, which was a couple days later. It was against the New York Liberty, a game that did not go well for Indiana on the floor. But I think just kind of standing there on the floor, and for NBA fans watching this, you'll remember in mid-May, the Pacers were in the playoffs and they were in the second round, and the Fever were just getting started. And we had this stretch of schedule where it was Pacers playoff game, Fever home game, Pacers playoff home game, Fever regular season home game. And every single night it would happen 4 to 5 times a week. That building was jam-packed, sold out. It would be sold out Pacers playoff game, and then sold out Fever regular season game, and then sold out Pacers playoff game. And I think that stretch as a member of this organization is maybe the high point in terms of excitement that I felt around everything. But look, as I kind of started the podcast here, it's just so gratifying to be able to have a role in all of this. I mean, I will be the first to tell you, people will come up and they'll say, congratulations. I'll say, I appreciate what you're doing and where you're coming from here, but I had nothing to do with any of this, right? I'm doing the same thing as I've had the great, great fortune to do for a very long time. Now this team and this league has such deserved spotlight on it. And, the other thing I want to say is the Simon family, who's our owners, they've been staunch believers in the WNBA since essentially its inception. The Fever's first year was 3 years after the inception of the league. And there have been tough financial times, and times where the Simons, maybe could have gone a different direction like so many WNBA franchises did, but they stuck with it. They believed in it. And if anybody deserves this, it's them. And so I'm so happy for them because they have remained steadfast in their belief in the WNBA, and they as owners are so deserving of all of this. And, to be able to play a small part in it and to be on team buses and team shoot-arounds and all of that, as a kid growing up, just wanting to broadcast basketball, it really is a dream come true.
Pat, final question for you. I want to ask you about the Indiana Pacers. Great season for them, as you mentioned. Great run. What else stood out to you, especially with just the rise of Tyrese Halliburton, just the impact Pascal Siakam had on this team as well? Like you mentioned, that dynamic with just the Pacers in the playoffs, their deep run, and then the Fever, their rise in popularity as well. What stood out to you for this Pacers this past season, and what are your early season impressions for next season for the Pacers moving forward?
Well, when I first look at the two teams from like a 20,000 foot view, it's just still sinking in that, hopefully here, fans of Indiana basketball are going to get the chance to watch the two best passing guards in the world for a long, long time. The fact that if you're an Indiana sports fan, you get to watch Tyrese Halliburton for 6 months and then go turn around and watch Caitlin Clark for 4 months. I mean, it's almost ridiculous the good fortune that fans have here. I thought last year's Pacers team, look, going to the conference finals, I think, was beyond anybody's wildest imagination. They caught some breaks along the way, but they took advantage of those breaks. But I think just the type of season the Pacers had in general, that was in my head kind of what I was expecting for maybe this upcoming season. I thought the next step for the Pacers, who were out of the top 10, they were not even a play-in team each of the previous couple of years. The next step was to get into the play-in tournament and to make the playoffs through the play-in tournament. That was my own personal goal. I don't want to say that was the goal inside Gainbridge Fieldhouse, but that was my kind of realistic, okay, you haven't been in the top 10 the last couple of years. Let's get into the top 10. Let's be there somewhere, and ideally not 10th, because it's really hard to make the playoffs if you're 10th. But let's see if you can't get into the playoffs through the play-in tournament. So to not even need the play-in tournament, being in the top 6 was kind of in my own personal roadmap for this team where I had them for this upcoming season. So you've made some great strides. You've brought in Pascal Siakam. Tyrese Halliburton has blossomed into an Olympian and potentially, right on the cusp of that superstar conversation. But it's, can you continue to build? Because as brilliant as last season was, let's take stock of the Eastern Conference right now. The Boston Celtics, until proven otherwise, are the best team in the NBA. The Philadelphia 76ers brought in Paul George, a big-time wing. The New York Knicks brought in Mikal Bridges and retained just about every other significant player there. The Milwaukee Bucks, if healthy with Giannis and Lillard, are in a different conversation than they were come playoff time this last year. So I think it's this fascinating balance of, you better celebrate what happened last year because it was really, really special. And do not let anybody try to take away any of the enjoyment of what you accomplished. But at the same time, a realization that just because you did what you did last year doesn't mean you're guaranteed anything going into next season. It was massive to get Siakam locked up long-term. It was good to get Toppin locked up long-term. And I think as this team, continues to grow, one of the best aspects is, of these teams that are in the upper echelon of the East, the Pacers might have the best young talent. Benedict Mathurin, Andrew Nembhard, Jarris Walker. Some of those players will have to prove that statement true. But in terms of upward mobility for the team, for the roster, it's those young guys. The Pacers didn't make a splash like the Knicks. They didn't make a splash like Philadelphia. But they've also got some young guys that could take significant steps forward going into next year and into the future. So I think the front office, it's always been an aggressive one. Who would have seen the Tyrese Halliburton move coming? Who would have seen? I think there was a lot of rumors about Siakam, but they got that trade done and they got him signed long-term. And so, I think it'll be one that continues to be aggressive if the right move is available. Kevin Pritchard has always been somebody that's willing to pull that trigger. But at the same time, they're in a really good spot, albeit in an Eastern Conference that may be the best the East has been in a very long time. And so no longer will the Pacers go into the year without significant expectation. That's the other thing. When you have an Eastern Conference Finals run, you go into the next year with people expecting you to be a top 6 team, expecting you to win a playoff series. And so that's a new, unique challenge that this team will face that it hasn't faced in a long, long time. And the players on this current roster, the last time they did, were not a part of this team. So all of that will be really fascinating here for me to watch. We were just doing a podcast for our own channel, and you can name 11 players that you really think probably should have a role on this team. And rarely do teams have 11-man rotation. So I think figuring out who is in that 9 or 10-man mix to start the year, good problem for Rick Carlisle to have, but a real significant challenge once the calendar turns to September and training camp comes around.
Well, the basketball world will have their eyes fixed on Indiana for sure. Pat, this has been a fantastic chat. Thank you very much for joining us. Can you please let our audience know where they can find you on social media and then where they can find you just with your Fever broadcast, anything else you're working on as well?
Sure. I'm at Pat Boylan Pacers. Twitter is really where I use the most in terms of getting content out, or X at Pat Boylan Pacers. I use that for both Fever and for Pacers. So our broadcasts are here. If you're local to Indiana, if you happen to be watching this in the area, WTHR is the network that carries most of our games. But the great part is League Pass is very affordable in the WNBA. And when we're not on an ESPN, an ABC, or a CBS, League Pass will carry our feeds, and it's a very reasonable rate. So there's a lot of different outlets that you can find the WNBA on, which is great. And if you're listening to our broadcast or watching our broadcast, we really appreciate that. And hopefully we're in for a great run here down the stretch. And gentlemen, I appreciate you giving me the time here to come on and talk with you here again. It's been fun.
Likewise. Thanks, Pat, again. Much appreciated.
Take care.